Was it elaborated, or are some things that clearly need to be challenged within it?
Well, we did agree with some of the comments she made about some of the start-up problems that were involved for the inquiry. You can't set up an inquiry of this scale from scratch without there being some of these issues. And indeed, since her departure, we have actually managed to address one or two of those important ones. We did not agree with her suggestion of any curtailment of the terms of reference or the scope of the inquiry. And there were other circumstances concerning her departure and the panel's position that were not referred to.
But if I can point out some specific things, and one issue that I took up with the Home Secretary before, she said one of the weaknesses of the inquiry was that it was not properly resourced. But it later turns out, as confirmed again by the Home Secretary yesterday, that last year, I think just under £3 million was actually returned by the inquiry to the Home Office because of an underspend.
Yes.
So that was factually incorrect.
It was factually incorrect.
And her references to not being given a free hand to recruit staff of the type that she thought essential, and that the panel and I, that is Lowell Goddard, have had little or no input into either the composition of the senior management team or the recruitment of secretariat staff. Is that correct?
Not to my knowledge. It's true that there were some staff recruited from the Home Office, as she's referred to. But I have no knowledge personally of how people were recruited in the beginning of the inquiry, because we were not engaged in that. That would have been a matter for the Secretary to the inquiry and possibly for Lowell Goddard herself.
And she said that that had resulted in skills and qualifications of many recruits not fitting the tasks which they were called upon to perform. Do you think that is a fair description of many people presumably still working within the inquiry?
I'm not aware of that.
And also, she complained about the tremendous amount of hard work had not been sufficiently visible or communicated widely enough in those 16 months. Is that true? And if it is, was it not her job to make sure that that was rectified?
I certainly believe that we did not fully communicate what we were doing widely enough.
So whose responsibility was it to resolve that?
I would suggest that it was the Chair's responsibility with the relevant staff managers.
And the specific criticism about the lack of an evidence management system, which she said held back you being able to hold these public inquiries, is that a fair criticism? And again, who is responsible for this?
That took a long time to put in place. I may say that I think within 2 weeks of my appointment, we rectified that. It is now in place. Large numbers of documents, many thousands of documents, have now been uploaded to the system, and that is no longer an issue.
So, overall, a lot of the problems that are mentioned in Dame Lowell's letter should really have been the responsibility of the Chair to seek to resolve and to take some responsibility herself if they'd not actually been resolved in her 16-month tenure. Would that be a fair assertion?
I would agree with that.
And could I perhaps ask all of you, what was your relationship like and your working conditions and working relationship like with Dame Lowell in her 60 months there that coincided with your tenures?
I'll
start, Professor Jay, yes.
The others can make their own contributions. It was clear from the beginning that Lowell Goddard really would have preferred to sit on her own without the assistance of a panel.
So you were redundant, in her view?
We were not redundant, and there are specific legal requirements that the Chair and panel make certain decisions, but many of them are for the Chair on their own. As a consequence of this view that was conveyed to us, we did feel that we were kept at a distance from a lot of the activities of the inquiry.
And is that something that manifested itself quite early on?
Yes, I'm sure we'll return to this, but we did make every effort to make the arrangements work from the beginning.
Mr. Frank, what was your assessment of your relationships with the Chair and how easy she was to work with?
Well, it's, I think, fair to say, and I've already said before, there were challenges. However,
that's a very all-encompassing word, challenges, usually.
Well, and indeed there were some fairly all-encompassing challenges too. But what I will say is the chair was not always present in the United Kingdom through that entire 16-month period. And so we were able to continue with our work for extensive periods without very much contact with the chair. There were times when things were perfectly amicable and perfectly professional. There were other times when it was less the case.
What does that mean?
Well, there are different working methods that people have and different experiences and backgrounds they bring to that. It may be that as a judge working perhaps mostly on her own, it wasn't easy for her to adapt to a situation where she was necessarily having to work in a more collegiate way. And there were times when it was obvious that was not a comfortable situation for her, and that led to challenges.
So was the office a rather calmer place when she was abroad than it was when she was in residence, would you say?
On the times that I was there myself, which was quite a lot, I would say that's probably the case.
So was she a nightmare to work with, as some papers have suggested?
I would not use that language.
What language would you use?
I would prefer to say that there were challenges.
I think this has been a circular exchange. Drusilla Sharpling, what's your view? Was these reports about her being abusive to staff and to a bullying extent, is that an accurate reflection?
Chair, I'm not going to engage in the sort of character issues that have been published across the press. It seems to me to be entirely inappropriate. These are matters which were not something which ought to be played out in the public domain. However, having said all of that, the panel had concerns about the qualities of leadership that were being evidenced throughout the course of the inquiry. That was our principal concern, and that was the reason why we wanted to work with the inquiry to ensure that these were overcome. Regrettably, that was not the case in the end.
How early on were those questions about qualities of leadership, as you put it, did they manifest themselves, would you say?
I wouldn't have said immediately. That's not the case. And I think to say that there was a single moment where this became evident would be wrong. It was the accumulation of matters which concerned the panel. And as I said before, we tried to do everything to manage that. It was our job to try and manage that for the benefit of the inquiry going forward.
But would you say that those questions over qualities of leadership manifested themselves on an accumulative basis, certainly within the first half of her tenure, i.e. in 2015, rather than having to wait until the 29th of July 2016?
I wouldn't have said, I can't say that there was a particular cut-off date. That would be entirely wrong. But it was a growing concern with panel members about the quality of her leadership that caused us to take various actions at various times.
And finally, for our colleagues to come in, to whom did these concerns over qualities of leadership get reported, if at all? And what was your reporting structure if there were issues around the person at the top?
Well, as I understand it, there would have been formal meetings with the Secretary of the Inquiry. I'm not familiar with those because they're under the former chair's purview. However, I do have something to say about what I did with the consent and knowledge of the panel.
Please.
That on at the end of April, I think the 26th of April, with the panel's knowledge, I reported my concerns about the leadership of the inquiry to the then Director General of the Home Office, Mary Callum. I want to take the opportunity to make absolutely clear that I did not give anyone permission to spread these concerns amongst anybody else, that I did not, and I did the panel require any action to be taken. As I've said before, and this remains the case, that the panel wanted to manage the inquiry in the most effective and efficient way possible, acting in its best interests.
And that happened when? Sorry, can you...
April of this year.
April of 2016. Thank you. OK, can I go to David Burries, then I'll come back to you. Thank you.
clarify, we've heard, reading the Times, multiple senior sources are referred to as that the recruitment of Judge Goddard was in blind panic after the resignation of Fiona Woolf. Now, the resignation followed in November 2014. There was then a process in which the Home Secretary carried a number of meetings out and discussions leading to Judge Goddard's appointment on the 4th of February. So that's been described by some as a blind panic. Your appointment occurred after the resignation on the 4th of August of Judge Goddard, and then 7 days later you were appointed. How would you describe your appointment, if others describe the longer process in relation to Judge Goddard as a blind panic?
Well, I don't know whether the first of your assertions or reported assertions is correct, because I have no information about how the Home Office conducted the recruitment of Lowell Goddard. When it comes to my appointment, I understand the Home Secretary consulted several people, including panel members, about what should happen next, and we considered continuity to be extremely important.
Yeah. Were you offered the role of chair before August 2016? In the previous iterations in discussions, were you previously offered this role?
No.
In terms of achievements, Judge Goddard has stated that I'm confident that there have been achievements and some very real gains for victims and survivors of institutional child sex abuse. Would you say that's an accurate verdict of her time? And if so, what precisely would you say those achievements have been?
I would say certainly the work on the Truth Project is very significant. It was complex to set up, but we did carry out a pilot in November, December of last year, in which all of the panel members here were involved. And we followed that through, and actually very recently, only in the last couple of weeks, we've had the 100th person have a private session within the Truth Project. I'm assuming people understand what I'm referring to here. And indeed, we have also dealt with another 100 through other means of contact, through written statements, etc. That would be a principal achievement. I would suggest, although this was a shared achievement, of course, and much of this was a continuation in the last few weeks of what previously had been overseen. But after that, there was the barristers in the inquiry worked very well in the initial stages to review the existing literature around child sexual abuse and case law, and produced very significant reports internally for us as a first step for moving on, and that's proved to be very, very valuable. And of course, preliminary hearings were conducted.
Anything else that you suggest are achievements?
Yes, there are achievements that are collectively the achievements of the inquiry. You know that it was our specific remit to ensure that victims and survivors were at the heart of the inquiry.
Yeah.
And we promised that we would do that, and we have delivered on that promise. Because victims and survivors are enabled to participate in the inquiry in 5 separate ways. Firstly, if we have a public hearing, and you know that a number of them, 12 of them have been already identified, they're able to give evidence as witnesses. Of course, some don't want to do that, so they've got the opportunity to give evidence in a private session, which is the Truth Project. In addition to that, we have the Victims and Survivors Consultative Panel, who weekly give us really helpful assistance to make sure that we do not lose sight of the importance of victims and survivors in this inquiry. And in addition to that, we have set up the Victim and Survivors Forum to enable those who wish to contribute to policy development in any way they wish to. And we are constantly reviewing. That is a project that is not finished. We are constantly reviewing ways in which victims and survivors can contribute. And for that reason, that is one of the collective achievements of the inquiry to date.
I mean, it's hard to put a price on justice, but in terms of the value of those achievements, £14.73 million in the last financial year, Is that acceptable when looking back as an achievement?
Can I answer that one? We said before that reducing the level of child sexual abuse in this country is not a choice between competing priorities. It is an imperative. Every child has the right to be brought up without the threat of being subjected to child sexual abuse. It's our job to make sure that we hold institutions to account for past failures and put in place policies to stop it happening in the future.
Yes, but at the same time, justice delayed can be justice denied, and ensuring that it happens at appropriate progress. Surely there's a legitimate question over the last year, given that amount of outlay, whether there has been sufficient justice and achievements for those very victims. Mr. Jay or Teresa.
Can I also add to that, there are 3 strands to our work. We've mentioned the Truth Project, we've mentioned the public hearings, there's a substantial research strand. These take time to set up if we are to do the job really properly and get to the entrenched issues that have inhibited institutions in the past from fully protecting children as they have deserved. This will take some time, and I'm afraid I'm not apologetic about that at all. However, we know that as we gather the information from those projects, from those strands of work, we'll be able to bring our reports together in what I would call a holistic way, drawing from research, drawing from truth in the appropriate way, because of course they are anonymised summaries of participants, and also from the public hearings as well. That seems to us...
OK, here we're hearing from panel members on the child abuse inquiry. Drusilla Sharpling speaking there, also Ivor Frank, another panel member, and the chair of that inquiry, Professor Alexis Jay, the 4th chairwoman of that inquiry. Professor Alexis Jay telling the Home Affairs Select Committee that Dame Lowell Goddard, her predecessor, didn't want to work with a panel. It was clear she would have preferred to sit on her own. Questions asked of the atmosphere within the panel and the behaviour of Dame Lowell Goddard following accusations of racism, of bullying, of aggression, denied by Dame Lowell Goddard. But Ivor Frank, panel member, said that the chair was not always present in the UK and there were challenges, in his words. With me now, the Labour MP Lisa Nandy, who had an urgent question put to the Home Secretary yesterday on this very issue. Lisa Nandy, what have you made of what you've heard so far?
Well, I think the comments from Alexis Jay have been enormously welcome. We've heard from several panel members who've been quite open for the first time, I think, about what's been going on behind the scenes in this inquiry. Some of what they've said is hugely damning about the progress that the inquiry has been able to make. They've painted a picture of an inquiry which behind the scenes seems to have been incredibly dysfunctional, not just in recent months, but actually going back quite a long way, at least 16 months while Justice Goddard was in tenure. And I suppose for me that begs the question then of how, given that concerns we now know were raised at a very early stage in April of this year.
Yeah, and this came from Drusilla Sharpling. The 26th of April, she reported her concerns about leadership to the then Director General of the Home Office. That's the first time we've heard that because the Home Secretary talked about July yesterday.
Yeah, and at an incredibly high level, those concerns were heard in the Home Office, which seems to contradict and undermine the claim that the Home Office knew about this was in July. And it begs the question then as to why no action was taken during all of those months, given the huge scope and remit of this inquiry and how profoundly important it is that we get answers on these critical questions about how child abuse was able to thrive in this country.
What about those questions about Dame Lowell Goddard and her chairmanship of that panel? Not always present in the UK was the remark from Ivor Frank, that it was difficult to work under those conditions.
And in addition to that, Alexis Jay has talked about the preference by the chair for working alone when the inquiry was set up in its current format in order to draw on expertise from across the board. We've also heard this claim from another panel member that there were real issues of tension within the panel which went back not just a few months, but actually right to the beginning of Justice Goddard's tenure, it's really difficult to understand how the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, wouldn't have known that these major issues were appearing within the inquiry, and it's difficult then to understand why no action was taken. Yesterday we had a former panel member out in the media talking about her concerns, how she blew the whistle and how she says she was then dismissed from the panel. The trouble for a lot of survivors of child abuse is that they know only too well from their own experience that child abuse thrives in a culture of denial and secrecy and cover-ups. And it seems to me a tragedy that what we're hearing from panel members this afternoon is that some of those characteristics have been taken on by this inquiry itself.
Drusilla Sharpling at the end there, though, keen to stress the work that is being done, the Truth Project she was talking about. Also, we were hearing about the relationship with the Victims and Survivors panel, addressing the inquiry weekly on what needs to be done and reminding them of why they are doing this. What other questions do you want to see answered this afternoon?
I think the MP David Burrows, who asked some of those questions, hit the nail on the head. It's to commend the panel for the work that they've done to make sure that victims' voices are heard and shape this process, but to recognise that what survivors want most of all is progress, to see the truth emerge and to see justice done and to see the lessons learnt for the future. And that hasn't happened to a great extent over the last few months. We're only now starting to discover the truth. What I'd like to hear next in this evidence session is more information about how whistleblowers will be supported and enabled to speak out, and what timescales the inquiry intends to operate to, because the truth is that many of the survivors who are taking part in this inquiry have waited decades to even see this inquiry established.
And they could be waiting up to another decade for this inquiry to conclude.
The real concern that I have is that some survivors, if this is allowed to continue, may die before they see justice. And that's why in the next evidence session, when the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office will give evidence, we need to see a different approach from this government. We need to understand when they first heard about these concerns, why those concerns weren't acted on, and what, crucially, Theresa May, Amber Rudd and the Home Office are going to do to make sure that the inquiry proceeds on a very different basis from the one that it appears to have operated along for the last 2 years.
And just very briefly, Professor Alexis Jay asked about her appointment. Is she the right person to be chairing this panel now, the fourth?
The fourth in 2 years, but I think there is a general feeling of confidence in Professor Jay. She's well known for the work that she did uncovering what happened in Rotherham, and she's well respected across the board. But she needs political support, most of all to create an open, transparent culture, which so far, frankly, we haven't seen from the previous Home Secretary or from this one, and I hope that this is the beginning of change.
OK, Lisa Nandy, thank you very much. Time now for a look at the weather.